you everyone for joining and everyone who's going to be listening later. Particularly big thanks to Insight Partners and to Steve for welcoming me to speak with you guys today. Really looking forward to this conversation. And I say conversation, I'll give a presentation for the first part of this and then open it up for questions at the end, and really would encourage you to ask anything that's on your mind. So the topic of today's conversation is about code quality and how do we take code quality and use that to move business outcomes forward. You see, we choose that really carefully, and one of the insights that I want us to all keep in mind: code quality is very important, but especially when you're talking to non-technical executives, it is a means to an end, and the end of business outcomes of revenue, of EBITDA. Can be enabled by code quality, but it's not the thing itself when it comes to business outcomes. And that's why we're talking about getting to those bottom line business outcomes through code quality. So Les, a little bit on me before we cover the agenda. So I was a former private equity software executive, doing portfolio company work for another private equity firm. Prior to that, I spent about 7 years of my career I was a McKinsey consultant, then spent 7 years of my career working in low-performing school districts, helping bring data to bear to improve outcomes. And there's some great war stories to tell about that, but the analogies from that work we have found to be incredibly applicable to here. From using student test score data, how do you actually get teachers and principals to use it to inform their practice and to deliver better educational outcomes? Those same lessons are quite applicable by analogy to bringing code quality outcomes and talking about code quality and putting them to work to improve business outcomes. So 30 seconds on SEMA, and so you know who we are and what we're about. We're a software company that analyzes code quality and the contributions of engineering teams to code quality. So we spend a lot of time thinking about how do you measure code quality, what does it mean to measure code quality, how do we think about it changing over time, and how do we think about teams' contributions to code quality. And that is why we have the great pleasure of joining you guys today. So 4 topics we're going to cover, and again, we'll go through these and make sure we have time for questions and hopefully a more of a discussion at the end. The first question: when you say code quality, do you mean there's only one standard that works in all situations? Those of you who saw the login panel know that the answer is no way. A leading question, absolutely not. We have to begin with the premise that code quality is absolutely contextual. Second, when we think about code quality then, how do we quantify the amount of it? And then also the financial costs of code quality, in the absence of code quality, technical debt. And we'll talk through a simple example and then a more complex example, so you guys get a sense of some of the range of outcomes that are possible. Third, how do we think about the impact of code quality and transparency, so just knowing the status of code quality on business outcomes. Steve informed me that should be a very short portion of this discussion. That was already very well known, so we won't spend time on it unless you guys want to go deeper. And then finally, how in a world where, if let's say everyone on this call is convinced of how to and listening in of how to use code quality to drive business outcomes, how do we work with other with other parts of the business, sales leaders, financial leaders, the executive suite? How do we think about the change management challenge beyond the tech team to start thinking about code quality to drive business outcomes? So with that, let's dive in. Is there one standard for code quality? Of course, absolutely not. And what we would say and what we do say is not only is there not one standard of code quality in general, there's not even a code quality standard for an individual organization, that it can vary. Application can and does varies application by application and repo by repo. And so just to give a few examples, I'm sure you guys can think of others. you would expect the code quality of a 2-year-old company or a 1-year-old company to be very different from a 20-year-old company. When we had a conversation with with investor in the last year who said, if code quality is great in the first year of a company's health, well, that just means that they're spending too much time getting code quality right and not enough time getting features out the door. This notion of minimum viable product and lean startup and such. So the age of the company is one of those big drivers. Second driver is what the content actually does. And so you can imagine this, the content of the software. And so code quality for an organization that's delivering electronic health records where health and safety is at risk might be different, could be different from a news aggregation site. So the content matters. Another way that this matters, and this is where we get into the application by application standard, is you think about, so for example, a 30-year-old legacy platform that's in maintenance mode, not adding any new features or functionality to it. The only thing that matters is it still works. Is it still working for clients, especially as you're migrating to the modern platform? That standard for code quality would be quite different from the modern platform where you are expanding, you're adding features and functionality and such. And so when you get to a more sophisticated definition of code quality and are measuring it in a more sophisticated way, you can keep track of and should keep track of, and frankly, today we already do this right in our heads, the difference between platforms that are in maintenance mode versus modern ones. And that's just a small example of how repo by repo, the standard of code quality might be different. And then finally, as an example of contextual code quality, we think about what we would call house rules. You might know these as linters for the technical folks on the call, but there might be coding practices that an organization wants to follow for reasons of making it easier for new developers to get up to speed, making it easier to switch, to step into a new project. And those house rules can be thought of as code quality as well, but they're very contextual and set organization by organization or development team by development team. So you're probably all already convinced by this, that there is more than one way to think about what code quality means. Nonetheless, we at CIMA would say that there still is a development transparency gap, which is to say that development leaders, as well as non-development leaders, have a lack of information about some of the fundamental questions with regard to software development. And I think for us, one of the clearest ways to make this point is to think about the data and the information and insight that's available from the sales team. It's also true for customer support, for example. So if you look at the sales team, you know the resources available, such as the number of salespeople and account executives, SDRs, and such. You measure out activities, things like phone calls made or emails sent. You know outputs of, and let's call those demos scheduled, where an output is an important thing, but it's not really the thing itself. The demo matters. The demo becomes an outcome, the thing that really matters when it actually turns into bookings, when it becomes sales. And so outcomes of this is where we actually are versus targets, this is what we want our outcomes to be, right? This is plan versus actual for sales quality. Even saying it that way seems a little bit weird, right? Because you just say, how are bookings and how are they compared to our quarter, right? You already have that information and it's very understandable and very transferable. You can then also see how bookings trends changed over time. And then finally, you can look at the data about sales performance, such as bookings, and use it to understand strong performers or sales team members who might need more coaching or who's developing the fastest. So performance management on the people side. So that's an example. Sales is an example of a function where there is today great information about, and there isn't a transparency gap for practical purposes. Software development, however, we very much believe that there is. So you do know that there are resources, how many developers you have in QA. You know activities, whether that's lines of code written or changes made, or those are probably the simplest ways to say activity. You even know outputs. You think about stories from Jira or another system. Did we complete this task? Those are all incredibly important. You must know them. But then if you go the next step down, the outcome in software development, where and how is the code good or bad? That might be known to an individual developer, but in almost all cases, it's not rolled up to the executive level, to the CTO, to the CIO, and then able to be exchanged and discussed and trade-offs made quantitatively with other members of the C-suite. It's also, except in very rare cases, it is not available to say, is our code getting better or worse over time? How is that code quality changing? And then also not available is to be able to use that for performance management. So the equivalent of which salesperson is overperforming, or which salesperson do we need to give extra coaching to? The equivalent would be who is improving our code the most, who has the most positive impact on code quality, which new developers are learning the system the fastest, who do we need to give extra time and attention to? So even though, as we discussed, there are many different ways to measure code quality, and the definition of code quality is varies situation by situation. Nonetheless, when it actually comes to measuring it, to rolling it up in a way that is useful and actionable for executives, not only in technology, but across the business, we believe that a development transparency gap still exists. And that's one of the reasons that, that CIMA came to be. So now that we've talked about code quality, let's talk about and the need to actually quantify it and and see its changes over time. How do we actually quantify it? And let's talk about, and so you see we switched from code quality to technical debt. A simple way to think about it in a way that you can sort of is responsive, is understandable to others outside the organization, the technical organization, is if you think about technical debt being problems with the code, so a lack of code quality. It is a way, sort of negative code quality is the simplest way to say it. In every context, just like in debt in general, you would always expect to see some technical debt, some low code quality. The question is, can we measure it? Can we quantify it? And can we translate it into a financial cost, in particular a financial cost to remediate? And so what I wanted to do is give you two examples, a simple one and a more complex one, so you guys get a sense of the range of ways. There's actually hundreds, if not thousands, of components that could potentially go into code quality. But when in doubt, you start with simple and then go to more complex. So we'll start with a simple example first. So here is a sanitized example of one repository, so one application that was written in 3 different languages, Java, Python, and Scala, and then it rolls up. There are 3 components of technical debt on this page. One is portions of the code that has too much complexity. A second is code that is duplicated. And a third is portions of code that do not have unit test coverage. So sub-portions of the code, there's not a unit test associated. We at CIMA believe our baseline presumption is that each of these represent technical debt, which is to say lower code quality. If you have excessive complexity, and over 60 is a technical term, that piece of code is very hard to modify, and it takes more time to maintain it, to fix it, to change it for the next iteration of the product. So that represents technical debt. If you have duplicated blocks of code, that's technical debt, because if you think of having 1,000 copies of the same file instead of one copy that's referenced in 1,000 places, well, every time you want to fix something, you have to make 1,000 changes, which both takes time and energy and effort, and also runs the risk of errors. Because if it's in one spot, you can fix it easily and quickly. If it's 1,000 spots, you might miss something. And then finally, the absence of unit test coverage, all things equal, is also a measure of technical debt. Now, there are some organizations who do testing different ways, and of course, in the spirit of contextual code quality, you take that into account. But in almost all of our client experiences, unit test coverage is something that organizations are working towards if they haven't achieved already, which is to say, of the important pieces of the code, do we have tests in place that measure, that we give us confidence that this code will work the way that we intend it to before it is built and before it is in production. So those three elements of technical debt do form a very basic and simple, hopefully it sounds simple to you guys, measure of technical debt. And here is when we take this and now translate it to non-technical audiences. And so for SEMA's world, what we do, and others can do it, of course, is you take the amount of these elements of technical debt and you translate it into person days in order to fix it. And so, for example, for the Java code base, and which the portion of the code written in Java, there was no test coverage. In order to get to the target level of, in this case, 80% for this client, it would take 41 person days. One person for 41 days, two people for 20.5, etc. Getting rid of code duplication, 17.8 days, module complexity, 13 days. That adds up to 72.3 days. And then we take a tunable standard for the cost of developers to fix. Our baseline of standard for a US-based developer is $500 a day. So you can see roughly 72 days times $500 a day, $36,000 to eliminate technical debt from the Java portions of this code base. You can see then, using that logic working across, there's only $90 worth of the Python code and $15,000 worth of technical debt for the Scala code. Combined, it's $49,142 worth. And then you can also, for total tech debt, if you were to eliminate all of it, and then you can also translate it into the amount of tech debt for the size of the code base. And so you can see here, 36,000 divided by 7,200 lines of code gets you $5 worth of tech debt per line of code versus Python versus Scala, and then for a blended average of a little under $3. SEMA's experience is that under $2 worth of tech debt per line of code is quite good. $2 to $5 is worth consideration. It's yellow on the traffic light, and over 5 is red, worthy of inspection. Those aren't necessarily conclusions that those aren't necessarily mandates to act, but they are certainly the place to start for deciding whether and where and how much of an investment to make. So hopefully this makes sense, and I know we'll take questions in a moment, but if this is in the category of simple elements of understanding tech debt, we did a couple different things. I just wanted to make it explicit. One, all of those elements, those 3 elements on this page, not only backed up by science, but experience, you could explain to a non-technical executive why it actually matters that those things exist, that it would make sense to reduce that technical debt. Second, and then really importantly, we translate it into, it is translated into financial metrics. Don't need to tell you guys, but when you can translate from technical speak into financial speak, you already make it that much easier to explain it to a non-technical audience. And then finally, enabling comparisons. And so this is within an application. You could also do across applications and be able to make those comparisons. And translating from the tech world to the non-tech world especially on definitions that are easy, on definitions of low code quality of technical debt, can be a big step in the right direction for getting the buy-in to make investments in code quality. So this is the simple version. For folks who want to learn more, there is we have a free tech debt calculator at SEMA that you can play with these metrics yourself, looking at your own repos. Happy to talk about that. But the point is, I would say, is you have to tune it for your circumstances. So you see in this example here, 80%, this organization chose to address 80% of excessive complexity. This number here says 80. The more tuning you get for the circumstances at hand, the more credibility you'll have with non-technical audiences. So this was the simple example of technical debt, and hopefully you guys are still with us. A more complicated version, which might be more applicable to insiders on the technical team, is to think about architectural quality. And here is a real example from one of our clients of 8 of their repositories. It looks at the architectural standards of object-oriented code. And you don't need to know much about it. You can just sort of squint and see one of these repositories, which is a subset of an application, is quite different from the others. Repository G, this dark purple, looks different relative to the other applications or the other repositories. It is more flexible, it is more functional, it is more effective. We know with confidence, even before having the conversation with the client, that this must be their modern platform, because they are aiming, even if they didn't know it, they were aiming for flexibility and effectiveness. And so this would be an example of understanding code quality at the architectural level, especially of particular interest to architects and senior leaders of the technical team. You'll notice, again, one of the common themes is making relevant comparisons. Sometimes there are outside world comparisons, like under $2, it's very good. Over $4 is a risk. Over $5, excuse me, is a risk. But almost always it gets back to what are the standards of code quality for us? And what you can see here is relative to themselves, these standards of quality are, these standards of code quality, you can see groupings that we believe very strongly are the right basis for making investment decisions and architectural decisions. So we started with a very simple example of code quality and those 3 measures, and then went to a more complex version, and there are many variations in between. Third part, what is the impact on code quality and code transparency on business outcomes? So why does this matter? As I said, Steve shared, this should already, you guys already know this, but if you think about this for internal to the organization, when you have code quality that is at the right level, and when you know what code quality you have, you can spend development dollars in line. You can spend development dollars in line with your business strategy. You can understand how to improve code quality to achieve better outcomes. You get more of the product roadmap built. SEMA was created in part because at one of the software companies I worked at, we took half of our developers and had them fix code. And as a result of fixing code, which is about the national average or international average, it's 55%. That means half as much new product development as you otherwise would be getting. And whether it's new features or functionality or literally a new platform, that is a drag on the business of not being able to build new features and functionality. And so when you know the state of the code and its quality and make intentional decisions about what quality level should we get to, you're able to fix the code faster when it needs to be fixed, and then otherwise go back to building in features and functionality and meeting the needs of the sales team and others. Those, if you think about it, are internal benefits of understanding quality and transparency of the code. Also just a reference, there are external benefits. So what are you working on, working with third parties? If you have a third-party development shop that you've enlisted, having a explicit, financially based trade-off based conversation about code quality makes it much easier to have a fact-based conversation about what you're getting, the value you're getting for your contract, and can you get more value from that third-party development shop. And then finally, if you're doing a tech due diligence, whether it's a new platform acquisition or bringing in an add-on or a tuck-in, you know what you're getting yourself into, and how much tech debt, and understanding some of the subject matter experts and superstars. So the people side can also be really helpful. Knowing the people side of their contributions to code quality can really make a difference. Finally, last section, and what I'll do, I'll go no more than 2 minutes over, Christina, and I'll stop at 32 to make sure there's time for questions. So how do you actually get started? So let's say everyone on this call is convinced that code quality matters, that measuring it matters, and investing in it matters. How do you actually get buy-in beyond the technical team to carry this out? There is a real change challenge, of course, and just to say a couple of them. Technology decisions for non-programmers, from non-technical folks, can feel incomprehensible. There's a great article, happy to send you the reference to it, from Bloomberg Business Week several years ago, in which a man in the taupe blazer, I'm using air quotes, shows up and says, you need to spend an exorbitant amount of money fixing old code. And it feels so scary to non-technical audiences. I'd encourage you to have that empathy when you're thinking about talking to those kinds of audiences. Second, as we mentioned, code quality, really important, but it is a means to an end for the business as a whole. If the business is trying to get to revenue and EBITDA, code quality can help make that happen, but it is not the same thing as getting to revenue or EBITDA. And of course, when you are maintaining code, by definition, you are not adding new features or functionality. Third reason for there to be a change management challenge is that people, when they hear about technology projects, think, oh goodness, this is going to run over time and over budget. The national average, at least for large projects, is at 90% run over significantly. So there's reason to be skeptical. And then the fourth thing that contributes to the change challenge is fixing code. For at least some, fixing code can be perceived by non-technical audiences as being fun in and of itself. SEMA's perspective, sometimes that's true, but actually in most cases, everyone would rather be starting with a clean sheet of paper and building the right next new thing. But in the back of minds of non-technical audiences, there is sometimes a risk that people think, oh, development teams or technology teams are asking for investment because it's fun for themselves to make an investment. It's fun for themselves to be fixing code. All of these factors, and others as well, translate into a change challenge, translate into getting challenges, getting buy-in from finance, from sales, from other executive team members for code maintenance. And so let's assume all of us on this call, we're in it to improve code quality in the right way to serve the business outcome. Our job in wanting to make that change is to actually carry it out in the right way, responsive to the change challenge. So I'm pretty sure Christina is going to share this presentation as well, so I won't read this. But a quote from 1854, one of my favorites in moments of real change, management. If real success is to attend the effort to bring a man to a definite position or person, one must first of all take pains to find this person where this person is and begin there. So you got to start and acknowledge with this change challenge, with the skepticism, or it's going to be even harder to get the investment to win the case for making investments in improving code quality. So we all want code quality. We want to make an investment in it. How do we begin? 6 tips and tricks, and happy to dive in more in the discussion period. Remember, you start first with code improvement problems that actually have business outcome. So not code quality for its own sake. A good way to do that is to start with business, non-technical leaders. What have been their experiences of code quality that are getting in the way of business outcomes? Everyone loves an idea that comes from themselves, right? So if you can choose for code quality investment that meets the needs of some of your skeptical stakeholders, you're much more likely to win them over. Definitely start simple. And so if you're trying to get buy-in on investing in tech, on reducing tech debt, some of those examples we shared earlier, test coverage, duplication, things that they understand will make it easier for them to follow along. Speaking non-tech, so we gave an example of this earlier. It's all too common, as we all know, non-technical audiences sometimes start glazing over if we only talk about in terms of tech. So whenever you can, back into financial impact, operational impact. When will this be done? How much will this cost? What are the trade-offs, cost and benefit trade-offs in financial terms for making these kinds of investments? I like to think about, from that analogy, how would a sales team make the case for expanding its sales team or for going into a new market? What kinds of information would they present back to the rest of the team? It is now possible through code quality technology to do that, almost exactly that in the code world. And so Steve, run that test in your head if it meets the needs, if it is how a development team would tackle it. A sales team would explain why they would need an investment. Could you give that level of clarity? Number 5, measure and share updates. If you've gotten that buy-in and you're then going to have a project, you must continue to share updates and financial and operational measures so that folks can understand if you're making progress or not. If you don't get the buy-in to do it and code quality is heading in the wrong direction, you share those updates too, as well as the impact on business outcomes. And finally, and yes, this is true for change management in general, life is not just tech debt or code quality, but life is a multi-round negotiation. So if you get the investment, you're going to own up to when you fall short, just as much as you are going to say when you celebrate your own successes. Because if you win on delivering code quality in small examples, you have more credibility and more buy-in for the larger ones. So for making deeper investment. And with that, I will pause and turn it over to Christina, see if there were audience questions. And again, so thank you guys for joining today.
Thank you so much. It was really, really insightful. We do have a few questions coming in. So the first is, how is code complexity defined?
Sure. In this case, it is cyclomatic complexity, aka McCabe complexity, and it's a way that the code interacts, the logical sequence of the code, of how the code interacts as information flows through. Very happy, so my email address is at the end, I'll just leave it here. Happy to send you some more technical information from some of the academic literature if you'd like to learn it.
Wonderful, that's helpful, thank you. Another question, so you talked about change management with different executive teams. Can you share a little bit more about change management with software developers?
Absolutely. So if one of the change management challenges is getting developers, is getting sales leaders and CEO and CFO bought in. Another change challenge, because this is a new world, is making sure that the tools are comprehensible to that you get buy-in from the development teams who would be measuring code quality in a different way. And many of the same change management principles apply. Probably the most important distinction to keep in mind is if now it is possible to not only measure code quality, but also think about, but also measure the impact of individual developers on code quality, then that becomes personal. And the moment it becomes personal, people very understandably across all professions start really wanting to make sure that it is as actionable and accurate and fair to them as possible. Probably the single biggest thing you can do when it comes to getting buy-in from, or maybe a couple things, to get buy-in from the development teams is while you're simultaneously getting buy-in for code quality improvements from other parts of the business, is to make sure that there is a shared commitment among the development team of, yes, no, code quality matters, and we should be making that kind of investment. And so going through that exercise of listening and getting their buy-in. Good news is that can typically be easier because they're experiencing code that's too complex, that's too duplicated, is harder to work with. And so their lives will be made easier if if code quality improves. But you don't want to skip that step. You actually want to make sure that the development teams are bought into using code quality as well. A second step is, and this is definitely a tips and tricks, is you may want to start with looking at code quality of a code base that is not your own, and letting developers understand, take an open source repository and let them look at the code quality of another organization or a code base that they didn't build, because it takes off some of the pressure, because they're not thinking about it in terms of the impact on themselves. And then probably the third part is, frankly, for as long as possible, stay away from the people side. And then that's one of the lessons from SEMA. There are developers out there who want to understand immediately, well, what is my contribution to it? But we have found code quality, but we found much more success, and we strongly recommend it. Just start with code quality overall, and let the team as a team get invested in making code quality improvements, and get them comfortable with that before you start opening up impact of individual developers on code quality, because that's just that's another level of getting comfortable with the data.
Really helpful. Thank you. If anyone else has a question, please feel free to enter it now in the question panel. Otherwise, we'll give you 5 more minutes back in your day. Matt, any final words?
It was such a pleasure to chat with you all. I'm sure you can tell we're very passionate about bringing code quality to bear on business outcomes. Feel free to reach out, and we would be delighted to chat and answer more specific questions or one-off questions. Plenty of reading material if you want to learn more, and happy to have a chat.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending, and big thanks to Matt. Have a great day.
This was so fun. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.